This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We're delighted to welcome Caroline Shenton to the Archives and Society seminar this evening. Caroline is the Director of Parliamentary Archives, but independently of that, she's written a fantastic book. There it is, and she's brought some copies along that apparently are cheaper than you can get them on Amazon. Should anyone wish to buy one, which is fact I have read it. It's very, very good. And Caroline's here to talk to us this afternoon about the book and the archive. Are you going to be focusing on the archive?
Yes, I am.
So over to Caroline to talk about the day Parliament went down.
Great, thank you very much, Valerie. Well, thank you all very much for coming. And I have 4 versions of this talk, but the one about archives and the day Parliament burned down is the one that gets the least airing, so I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about that today. So the day Parliament burned down, the 16th of October 1834, was for people at the time an event that they never forgot. It was absolutely staggering for them. It occupied the papers for weeks, months, even years afterwards. Its repercussions were felt right into the 20th century. And to them it was like the assassination of JFK or the death of Princess Diana in our own time. Really an event they never forgot. But today it is a forgotten event, very largely. And I think that's because the main reason is that the new Houses of Parliament, built by Barry and Pugin subsequent to this fire, this great iconic building on the banks of the Thames, symbol of London, symbol of Britain, the world over, is so well known that it's really obliterated from our memory what went before. And particularly for archivists in this country, it's definitely worth remembering because, as we'll see, it had a very profound effect on the way that the country kept its records. So I'm going to take you through the story of the fire, but before I do that, I'm just going to orientate you, for those of you who are not so familiar with Westminster perhaps. Here is, of course, the Houses of Parliament today, on the banks of the Thames, and most people think of the Thames as running from west to east through London, which it basically does, but at Westminster, in actual fact, it's taken a turn and it's actually running from south to north. So this is the southern end of the palace here, and that's the northern end. And that's just to let you know that, because I'm going to be talking about the north and south ends during the course of this talk. And here on the land side is the southern end of today's palace, Victoria Tower here, the great square tower at the southern end, which is where we house the Parliamentary Archives today. It's actually built as a purpose-built archive building for Parliament by Charles Barry. And this space in front here is called Old Palace Yard. And the old palace, the palace before 1834, was much smaller than the current palace. And it probably came up only to about halfway along the current west front of the palace. So it occupied this space here. It didn't reach as far down south as the current palace does, and it looked like this. So rather different from the great Victorian Gothic monster that's there now. What you can see here is a higgledy-piggledy mass of buildings that grew up over the centuries from the Middle Ages onwards. By the end of the 18th century, this chaotic collection of buildings was very ramshackle and run down. It was a bit of an eyesore. So the master of the King's Works, the great architect James Wyatt, decided to do something about it, and he built a facade here on the front of the House of Lords. So this block here is, if you like, a screen across some pretty chaotic buildings behind. But this screen was very unpopular with MPs. They called it the cotton mill, the factory. The press was less polite, and they called it the gentleman's lavatory. It didn't go down at all well, and that's because the Office of Works was thought to produce the ugliest buildings imaginable at the time, and in particular Buckingham Palace was thought to be a national scandal. At the southern end of the old palace, there's this ceremonial entrance here, That was built by another great architect, John Soane, in the 1820s, and that's designed to be a ceremonial entryway into the palace at state opening. This block here is part of the House of Commons. The middle floor are Commons committee rooms, and the top floor there is Bellamy's refreshment room. So this is the place where MPs would go to get a chop and the best claret in London. And then just peeping out across here, across the rooftops there, that's the southern gable end of Westminster Hall. And I've spent a bit of time talking you through that because we're going to be coming back to that view later on in the presentation when the fire develops. So the northern end of the palace today is very, very well known. This is the clock tower, better known as Big Ben, but actually Big Ben is in fact the bell. It's recently renamed the Elizabeth Tower, but I have to say that I can't quite bring myself to call it that. And you can see here the two twin towers, two square towers on either side of the north gable end of Westminster Hall. And this is New Palace Yard, but in 1834 New Palace Yard looked like this. You can still see the two square towers on either side of Westminster Hall, but otherwise it looks very different. There's this block here, the Law Courts, again built by John Soane in the 1820s and designed to house the Law Courts, which up until then had actually taken place inside Westminster Hall from the Middle Ages, from the 13th century up until about 1822. The main law courts, Chancery, the King's Bench, Common Pleas and so on took place inside the hall itself, because the Palace of Westminster wasn't only the main royal residence in London, from the 12th, 13th century onwards. It was also, because that's where the monarch was, that was the place where the law emanated from. It was the house, it was the home of the law courts, and it was also the home of government before Whitehall. There were a lot of government functions clustered around the palace, and in particular, this block here, this red-roofed building here, is the Exchequer. So the medieval and early modern finance department of the state was based at Westminster, and in 1834 it was in these buildings here. And that plays an important part in our story. You can probably see at the front of the law courts here that there are some upper floors, and these were occupied by another department of the Exchequer at the time called the Augmentation Office, and this was a sub-department of the Exchequer that had been set up during the reign of Henry VIII to deal with the income and the auditing of all the money flowing into the government as a result of the dissolution of the monasteries. And it also, by building the law courts here on the front of Westminster Hall, it brought the palace very, very close to the east end of Westminster Abbey, which is what that is, much closer than the building is today. So that's New Palace Yard in 1834. So just taking a cross-section through the palace, this is a wonderful survey today at the National Archives, actually measured just 2 months before the fire itself. So it's really our final view of the palace, and one of the most tantalising things about the old palace is that we know very little about its interiors. So it's a real treat to have this available to us still. What it's showing is this is Westminster Abbey side here, the riverside is there. Here are the committee rooms that I mentioned earlier when we were looking across Old Palace Yard. That's Bellamy's refreshment rooms there. And here's a southern window, southern gable end of Westminster Hall again. But you can see that this is a building that's been altered and changed constantly over the centuries. All the floor levels are higgledy-piggledy. All these rooms have been partitioned. If you were an MP in the Middle Ages and later periods, up until 1834, you would come into the building through this tiny doorway here, up these steps, up, across these floors, down. Nothing ceremonial about here. Across here, up. You'd finally get to this space here. That's the lobby of the House of Commons, and just by this fireplace there, Spencer Perceval, the Prime Minister, was assassinated in 1812, shot dead by a madman who had a grudge against the government. And then finally you'd make it into the House of Commons chamber, which is this space here. But before we look at that in a bit more detail, you can probably see that this block by the riverside of the House of Commons was once something else. It wasn't the House of Commons chamber. It only became that in the middle of the 16th century. In the Middle Ages, it was the Chapel of St Stephen's, the royal chapel of the palace, and you can see that it's got a sort of church type profile here. But at the end of the 17th century, Christopher Wren put a ceiling in here and a floor there, and turned what had been a wonderful Gothic chapel from the 14th century, probably looking very similar to the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, turned it into a little box, a tiny little wooden enclosed box, which was better suited for debates, or so he thought. If you're a woman in 1834, you weren't allowed to attend debates and sit in the gallery here. You had to bribe a doorkeeper who would take you up into the attic up here, and you would stand around, can you just see it, stand around this ventilation shaft here and peer down through the little windows that are just there in the middle onto the feet of the MPs and the speaker debating below. So it's very unsatisfactory for women, as well as for the MPs. This is what the interior looked like just before the fire. This is a sort of multiple portrait of all the MPs who were returned after the Great Reform Act in 1832. MPs in the early 1830s were complaining bitterly about their accommodation. Horribly hot and stuffy, they said, incredibly cramped, as you can see. When there were great debates, like there had been around the Great Reform Act just 2 years before, condensation ran down the walls. It was a completely intolerable place to work. And there were two debates in 1831 and 1833, led by the MP Joseph Hume, suggesting that they should move out of Westminster altogether. One suggestion was for them to go to St James's Park, which is becoming a very fashionable centre of the West End. The West End was expanding westwards, funnily enough, and becoming very trendy. Another place that was suggested was Regent's Park, which had been developed in the previous couple of decades, and the zoo, London Zoo, had just set up there in 1829. And so some people might feel that that was an appropriate place for MPs to decamp to. But both of these suggestions fell. The motions weren't carried. But on the night of the fire, a wag in the crowd was heard to say, "Mr. Hume's motion for a new house is carried without division." So what caused the fire? Well, some of you may know this already. And here's one I prepared earlier, which I'm going to pass around. It's a facsimile. It's not the real thing, don't worry. Please give it back to me at the end. Shouldn't be a problem with a small audience. When I have sort of like large audiences, it usually gets stuck somewhere and I have to go searching for it at the end. So this is a tally stick. These are tally sticks. These are, if you like, the primary cause of the fire. And one of the reasons that I became fascinated by the fire was that when I used to work at the National Archives, Public Record Office as it was then, one of my cataloguing jobs was to catalogue this strange collection of wooden sticks. So I found out quite a lot about these in the 1990s. And then I forgot all about them until I moved to the Parliamentary Archives, and they popped up again, as we will see. So what's a tally stick? Well, a tally stick is an instrument of the Exchequer. It's a form of medieval receipt. And it's a stick about 6 inches long, as you can see, shaped on four sides. And if you were a sheriff in the Middle Ages, you would be told by the king to go off and collect taxes in your county, and you would come to the Exchequer, those red-roofed buildings in the earlier slide, twice a year, once at Michaelmas and once at Easter, and you'd hand over the bag of money that you'd been told to collect. And when you did that, the tally cutter in the Exchequer would cut you one of these tallies. And he would write on the side of the tally your name as sheriff and the county that you were sending the taxes in for. And he would put notches, carved notches at the end of the stick. and the notches indicate the sum of money that's been paid in. So a little hole for a halfpenny, a little slice for a penny, a bigger slice for a shilling, a bigger slice for a pound, then £10, £100, £1,000, and so on. And then he would take the stick and with a chisel and a mallet, he would split it in two. So what you've got there is half a stick. You can probably see a bit's being broken off it. And the Exchequer would keep one half and you, the Sheriff, would take away another half. And the idea is that it's not possible for it's not possible for the Sheriff to come back in 6 months' time, the next time he hands over his bag of taxes, and say, actually, I paid in £5 more than you said I did last time. Because all the tally cutter has to do is to take his half of the stick, which has been kept in the Exchequer, match it up with the Sheriff's half, show that the notches exactly match, and say, no, actually, this is the right sum, we haven't miscalculated. That's how much you paid in last time, and you still need to pay in a bit more. So the idea is that it's an unforgeable receipt for government income. And amazingly, this process carried on from the 13th century right up until 1826. There was, however, a wider cause of the fire. The tally cutting process officially stopped by statute in 1783, but that was just officially. In theory, it stopped by law, but in practice, it carried on until 1826 because of the sinecure system in place in the public service at the time. What do I mean by that? Well, sinecure, if you don't know, is when a public official is given a post, they take the money for it, but they don't do any of the work. They delegate the work to a deputy who has to do all the work, doesn't get the salary for it. And this is very common in the public service at the time before the reforms of the mid-19th century of the civil service. And in fact, what had happened with tally cutting was that although the process was officially stopped in 1783, it actually carried on until 1826 because they had to wait for the last sinecure post holders in the Exchequer to die before the actual process completely stopped. And what that meant was that in 1834, in these buildings here, there were 2 rooms full of tally sticks left over from this process, not going all the way back to the 13th century. I think that's often a misconception that these were medieval sticks. They were probably very recent. They were probably tally sticks from the previous few decades. But they'd accumulated there, and the whole process had stopped. Nobody had thought to throw them away. But on the 14th of October 1834, Mr. Webley, who was Clerk of Works at Westminster, received an order from the Treasury to clear out those rooms because they were needed for the use of a new court of bankruptcy, and there wasn't space in the law courts to house the new court. They needed those rooms in the Exchequer. So Mr. Webley made the decision to burn them in a big bonfire behind the Exchequer offices, just where that tree is between the river and those buildings. And then he slept on that, and the following morning, the 15th of October, he came up with an even better idea. He thought this bonfire idea was a bad one because it was going to encourage, he thought, people to pilfer, and it was going to cause even more annoyance to the neighbours. So he decided instead that the tally sticks should be disposed of by burning them in the furnaces underneath the House of Lords chamber. So on the 16th of October, 2 workmen began burning tally sticks underneath this room here. This is the interior of the House of Lords as it was in 1834. This is a first floor room. The furnaces are in a basement, if you like, but it's a first floor basement, it's a ground floor basement. There were signs throughout the day that all wasn't going very well. There was sort of smoke in the air. There was a strong smell of burning, but nobody went to investigate. Things really start to hot up, as it were, by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when 2 gentlemen tourists are looking around inside the chamber, being shown around by the housekeeper. And they've come to see the Armada tapestries, which are, on the wall here. The Armada tapestries were very famous tapestries woven to commemorate the victory over the Armada. They were created at the beginning of the 17th century, gold and silver thread, wonderful pieces of luxury, conspicuous consumption from the Low Countries, and they'd hung in the Lord's Chamber since the early 17th century. And they were one of the sights of London, and you'd go and see the Abbey in the morning with your guidebook, and then you'd nip across the road, just as you do today, to see the Houses of Parliament in the afternoon. So these two tourists have come to see the tapestries and the other wonders inside the palace, but they're very disappointed because, as they tell the public inquiry that followed the fire, there was so much smoke in the chamber that they couldn't see it. So what's going on? It's like masses of smoke, so much that it's not possible to see these tapestries. The housekeeper tries to distract them from their disappointment, and she takes them over to this pew type area here, which is called Blackrod's box. Blackrod is the Queen's representative in the House of Lords, who sits there during sittings. It's actually about 10 days away from a sitting of the House of Lords. They're on recess at the time of the fire. They go over to have a look, but as they approach, they have to step back because there's so much heat coming up through their boots that their feet are in danger of being burned. So they say to the housekeeper, "What's going on?" And she says, "Don't worry, it's just some chaps downstairs burning tally sticks," and she sort of hustles them off to another part of the palace behind the curtains at the throne end. So what is going on? Well, what's happening underfoot is that the furnace flues run under the floor of the room above, and they then run up the walls here, either side of the walls, and then they exhaust out through the ceiling through chimneys. And the idea is that they're a form of underfloor heating, a central heating system for the building, and they're usually meant for coal. On this occasion, being stuffed full of wood throughout the whole day has caused the interior of the furnace lining, copper lining, to melt. And the copper isn't the only thing that's wrong with the flues. The flues have already been compromised because there are many ironies to this fire, but one of them is that just a few months before Parliament had passed its first legislation banning child chimney sweeps from going up chimneys to clean them. What would have happened in previous years would have been that the floorboards would have been cut open here, then the bricks would have been cut and lifted out, and a small boy would have been pushed down the flue with a brush to clean out the flues to make sure all the sit inside didn't catch fire. Well, that hadn't happened on this occasion because of this new legislation. When that had happened in previous years, the bricks would be put back, but there'd be little tiny cracks left. They could never quite seal it up properly, and this would happen repeatedly every time the flues needed sweeping. So what's happened is that there's a chimney fire inside the flues, and the smoke is emerging through these cracks. And why doesn't the housekeeper do anything about it? Why isn't she concerned? Well, we're back to, if you like, the wider cause of the fire, the sort of institutional inertia, the corruption of the public service at the time. The actual housekeeper, the real official housekeeper of the House of Lords, is a posh woman called Frances Brandish. But she never sets foot inside the palace because she's, again, one of these sinecure post holders. She takes the money for the job, she has the title, but she's delegated the work to a deputy called Jane Julia Wright. And Jane Julia is out on the day of the fire, and she's left her mother-in-law in charge. So it's the mother-in-law who's showing the gentlemen tourists around, and it's very clear from the answers that she gives at the public inquiry that again follows the fire, she's really not got a grip on the situation. I think the kindest interpretation you can put on it is that she's confused, but actually I think she was probably senile, looking at the answers, which are just, completely, she just doesn't really grasp either what was going on the day or indeed what has happened since. To be fair to her, however, and the family, of course, because they don't hold this post officially. They're not getting a salary for it. They're entirely dependent on the tips from the tourists to provide a living for the family. So she's much more concerned with ensuring that the tourists have a good time rather than investigating any health and safety crises that might be emerging underfoot. So the workmen stop work about 4 o'clock. They go up across the road to have a pint of beer, and the housekeeper comes back and the tourists have left. She locks up the chamber about 5. And all is quiet for about an hour, and then at 6 o'clock a doorkeeper's wife comes back from running an errand, sees a flickering under the door of the chamber, opens up the doors, sees that the fire is now licking up the curtains here on Blackrod's box. The heat under the floor has finally come through and caught on the wooden fittings here, and she screams out, "Oh good God, the House of Lords is on fire!" And then there's panic inside the palace for about half an hour. Mr. Webley runs up onto the roof, tries to throw a bucket of water down the chimney, to no avail. Mrs. Wright and her maid run out into the street without their bonnets on. That's how shocking it was, that they had to rush out so quickly, undressed, coming out into the street. They don't alert anybody at the northern part of the palace. They don't alert anybody in the commons. They don't alert anybody in the outside world. But the outside world is alerted about 25 minutes after that, about 6:30, when an enormous ball of flame bursts out of the front of this cotton mill frontage and up through the roof, lighting up the London sky. And I learnt a lot about firefighting theory while researching this fire, and I can tell you that what's happened is a flashover. And for those of you who don't know what a flashover is, it's when the gases in a fire rise to the ceiling, and as they fall, all the hot smoke heats up all the fixtures and furnishings in an enclosed space, and they spontaneously combust, and a great fireball happens. And it's very clear from eyewitness accounts that that's what's happening, and it looks like this. So it's an enormous fire. It's the most significant fire between 1666 and the Blitz, and it can be seen from the high ground all around London. And the King and Queen don't need to be told that it's happening. They're 20 miles to the west at Windsor Castle, but they can see it from there. Hundreds of thousands of people immediately flock to Westminster to see what's happening, so that within about half an hour all the streets and bridges are completely clogged, and it's impossible to get close, but people are watching from all the high ground around London, Hampstead, Highgate, Blackheath and so on, to get a better view. And Charles Barry, the architect of the new palace, is coming back from doing work in Brighton, and as he comes over the top of the South Downs in the stagecoach, he sees the fire below him and is supposed to have said, "What a chance for an architect." The immediate response to the fire comes from parish fire engines, which are very small little mechanical engines pumped by perhaps 2 people. Also, a couple of private insurance company engines turn up on the site, because at the time London didn't have a public fire brigade. It was entirely down to individual householders to insure their property and then call on whichever insurance company was dealing with them to come and fight the fire. But just the year before the fire, there had been a new development, and 10 of those private insurance companies had got together to create a single consolidated brigade for London. It was still a private brigade, it wasn't the public fire brigade like we've got today, but it was a bigger brigade, and it was more expert and more professional, and they pulled together all their equipment, and they were under the control of this man, James Braidwood, who was a Scot who had been in charge of the Edinburgh Fire Brigade, and he had come down to London just the year before the fire to set up this new brigade, the London Fire Engine Establishment, as it was called. And he's really the grandfather of British firefighting theory. A lot of his firefighting methods really sort of laid the foundation for today's firefighting understanding. And The brigade headquarters is in the City of London by St Paul's, and he receives the call about half an hour after this great fireball emerges from the palace. So time is ticking on, and we're about an hour now from when the fire first emerged. He immediately turns up with his men, about 66 firefighters and 14 engines, at Westminster. The palace is not insured, Parliament isn't insured, but he and his men nevertheless turn out to come and try and help to fight this enormous fire, which by this time looks a bit like this. So this is that view of Old Palace Yard again that I showed you at the beginning. This is a very crude, sensational engraving. As you can see, it's designed to be handed out in the days after the fire. It's designed to titillate, if you like. It's the tabloid view of the fire. And I think there are a number of interesting things on here just from our point of view. You can see how the authorities, the soldiers here and the police have cleared this space in Old Palace Yard to let the firefighters do their work. But they're also holding back the crowds because it's not clear to them at this stage, of course, that it's an accident. They've no idea that it's an accident. As far as they're concerned, this could just be the first stage of a national uprising, and there was lots of unrest in the country following the passage of various laws, including the Great Reform Act and the Poor Law Amendment Act, which of course introduced the whole workhouse system as it was known in the Victorian period. That had happened just a couple of months before the fire. There'd been a lot of agrarian unrest in the countryside, called the Captain Swing riots at the time. There'd been a revolution in France in 1830, so the authorities were very alert to any possibility that this might be the first sign of a revolution, and I think that is what this building is showing us here. And also, if you look here, you can also see how quickly the fire has already captured the buildings. Because these buildings have grown up over the centuries, there's no fire breaks or any fire protection as we would understand it today, and it takes hold incredibly quickly. A second view here, this is a much better view. I love this view. This is William Heath's view. William Heath is a well-known engraver, and this is a lithograph which he very proudly states at the bottom on the wider caption, which you can't see here, drawn by the light of the flames from the bottom of Abingdon Street, he says. So he's drawing this from life, and it's a documentary view, or a piece of reportage, if you like. And you can see the very strong southwest wind here that's blowing the flames across the core of the palace, the householders hanging out of their windows. You can see St Margaret's Church here in the background, which became a repository for salvaged furniture from the palace. Not a very sensible place, you might think. It's so close to the flames, just a change of wind direction away from disaster, as is the east end of Westminster Abbey here, the Henry VII Chapel. And just behind this building here is the chapter house of the Abbey, which is where some of the public records were stored at the time of the fire. And similarly, the augmentation office records, which I mentioned at the beginning, stored in the law courts, are behind this block here, reaching backwards behind this block. So they are in great danger. Looking at the centre of this lithograph now, you can see even more. You can see the fire engines taking their water supply from the street plugs or the fire hydrants that give access to the pipes of water under the street. There's one gushing there. There are volunteers pumping the engines. The firemen aren't there to pump the engines and pull the water through. They're there to man the hoses and spray the water over the fire. You can see a fireman here about to go into the palace to save a treasure with his little axe there, perhaps. We know that this is how the ceremonial silver maces of the House of Commons were saved on the night of the fire. So if you ever watch Prime Minister's Question Time, see the big silver mace on the table during debates. That was saved on the night of the fire by a fireman, probably rather like that one. Here is a horse and cart with a pile of books there. being evacuated from probably the Lord's Library, possibly the Commons Library, but more likely the Lord's Library. And this is how I became interested in the fire in the first place. So I'd moved from the Public Record Office to the Parliamentary Archives in 1999, and one of the first things I had to be trained on in our search room was that nearly all of the House of Commons records were destroyed in this enormous fire of 1834. So there would have been tens of thousands of records, maybe hundreds of thousands of records of the Commons from the late 15th century up until 1834, stored within the building. They perished on the night of the fire, and only one key series, the journals of the House of Commons, the manuscript minutes of proceedings in the chamber, survived. Somebody obviously made the decision that that had to be saved, and somehow they were saved. It's not clear how, it's not clear exactly where they were, and they don't, as far as I can see, show much sign of having been fire damaged or having been thrown out of windows, but somehow those survived. But that is really all that's left of the Commons records, and I became fascinated by this great disaster, but I couldn't find anything out about it. One of the first things I managed to squirrel out was a copy of the public inquiry report that followed the fire, looking into its causes, and I kept finding things in the papers and so on, I kept putting things into a drawer, and after about 8 years I realised I'd got enough stuff about the fire that I really ought to write an article about it, and then I discovered I'd got even more material than I thought I had, so it became a book. So that's how it came about, really. And I remembered about having catalogued the tally sticks when I was at the PRO as well, as a young archivist. So it all started coming back to me, and I felt like my whole archival life was sort of driving me towards, doing an account of this great fire, which wasn't just a great architectural disaster, but also a great archival one as well. And then finally there's this figure here. I don't know if you can see him. Can you see what that is there? It's a dog. And it's this dog, Chance, the celebrity fire dog mascot of the London fire engine establishment. So if Chance had been around today, he would have been on the front page of Hello magazine every other week. He's the London fire engine establishment's adopted dog. They adopted him from a Whitechapel, Spitalfields weaver, because he kept turning up to fires, and he was there on the night of the fire, barking and messing about and so on. We know that because Dickens, who was at the time not a novelist but a parliamentary reporter, just at the start of his career, writes about Chance in a parliamentary sketch, one of his very first pieces of independent writing. At the time of the fire, he was a journalist sitting in the public galleries of the Commons, writing copy that he was sending back to the Morning Chronicle, one of the main London papers that employed him. But he describes Chance at the fire, so we know that Chance was there. And this is William Heath's picture of him, in fact, at the fire. And he's wearing a collar that says, "Stop me not, but onward let me jog, for I am Chance, the London fireman's dog." And Chance doesn't die at the fire, I'm pleased to say. He dies about a year afterwards of natural causes, but the firemen love him so much that they send him off to be stuffed, and the taxidermist unfortunately realises that he's got a gold mine on his hands because Chance is such a celebrity, and instead of giving him back to the firemen, he passes him on to a fairground owner. And the firemen have to go back and grab their dog. There's a fight with the fairground owner, and they take the dog back to their headquarters in Watling Street in the City of London, and he stays there until 1880 in a glass case. But then he's auctioned off for a Fireman's Benevolent Fund. And we don't know where he is today, so should you be hanging around, a car boot sale, or a flea market, or down the Portobello Road or something, and you see a stuffed dog that might possibly be Chance, then I'll be very pleased to hear from you. And then finally, the third view across Old Palace Yard during the course of the fire. This is Turner's view. Turner was there on the night of the fire. He's here on land, produced this watercolour sketch subsequent to the fire, and I think that what this captures is the terror of the occasion for many people. The fire had been very, very little written about previously. Maybe it had got a couple of paragraphs in books about the old palace, the new palace rather. And those paragraphs tended to say the same sorts of things. They tend to say things like people were standing around clapping and cheering because the Houses of Parliament were burning down. And actually, if you look in detail at the newspaper reports and the eyewitness accounts and people's diary entries, it's clear that they weren't standing around clapping because the buildings were going up and it was a fantastic, sort of triumph, and they hated the politicians, although one or two people might have thought that. In actual fact, I came to the conclusion that they were clapping because this was such an overwhelming experience. It had almost become objectified. It was like a theatrical performance for them. They'd forgotten that this was a real life event. It was like an entertainment by the end. So overwhelming, so terrifying, so spectacular for a generation that had never seen limelight on the stage or electric lighting, had never experienced the floodlighting of the stonework in Westminster Abbey, that their only response really was to clap whenever a fireman did something incredibly brave, or whenever a huge sheet of flame shot up into the air, or whenever they just dodged the sparks coming over their heads. And it's very clear that a number of people in fact suffered from psychological effects from this fire. People were physically injured by the fire, but also psychologically injured. And the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, for example, who suffered from depression throughout his life, in his very low periods, his Victorian biographer, his contemporary biographer, tells us that he would have these very traumatic flashbacks to the fire when he was at his lowest point, because of course he, with all the cabinet and many politicians, were there on the night of the fire, desperately trying to save the building. And from our point as archivists, what's also interesting is the effect that it had on somebody like Thomas Phillips. So Thomas Phillips, a very well-known manuscript collector, and there's barely an archive or a library in the country that doesn't now hold one of the dispersed Phillips manuscripts which were sold after his death. He lived in St John's Wood, and on the night of the fire, he rushed down in his coach to see what he could do, battled his way through the crowds, and he was there outside the law courts buildings where documents were being thrown from the top floors from the augmentation office, and also the parliamentary records were desperately trying to be evacuated in other parts of the building, and he was scrabbling around in the cobbles as coaches ran over them and as the firemen shot water everywhere, and he was pulling these ancient manuscripts out of the cobbles where they were getting muddy or just ground to a pulp by people's feet. And he did that all night, and he was obviously completely traumatized by the event, to the extent that the morning after, he went back to his house, and this great manuscript library that he'd got in his residence, he ordered that all the shelves should be redesigned, so they should be turned into coffin-like boxes with drop-down lids and rope handles, so they could immediately be evacuated if there were ever a fire, so that this sort of thing wouldn't happen again. So he became very sort of obsessive-compulsive thereafter about his collection, and I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of the fire, the psychological effect on contemporaries, and I think Turner fantastically captures that here. So by mid-evening, the House of Commons perished. That's it there in the middle. It's behind this sheet of flame is Westminster Hall, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer shouts around this time, "Damn the House of Commons, let it blaze away, but save, oh save the hall." And this is the saving of Westminster Hall. It's there today still. The great Anglo-Norman feasting hall of the Palace of Westminster, the oldest surviving part of it, dating from the 1090s, which is with its amazing late 14th century hammer beam roof, one of the great masterpieces of medieval architecture here. And hundreds of people, from the highest, the king's illegitimate sons, down to the lowest, sort of stonemasons and labourers who were at work in the palace anyway, were there desperately trying to save the hall from the oncoming flames. And the firemen in particular were very brave in fighting the fire outside Westminster Hall. They stood, 3 of them stood on this tiny little ledge, this little lead flat as it's called, outside the south window, with fire all around them. These buildings here engulfed in fire, and fire in front of them, and behind them the shattered windows of the glass. And they sprayed the water over the oncoming flames to try and prevent it from getting to the roof. So it was their efforts and what was going on the eastern front of the palace, the riverside of the palace, that ultimately saved Westminster Hall. So what you can see here is the riverside. It's low tide. You can see there's a shoreline, the muddy shoreline here. There was no embankment at the time. That only came later with the new palace. You can see hundreds of people on the shoreline looking at the burning buildings here. St Stephen's, the House of Commons here, and Westminster Hall behind there. They're just gawping at the view. It's low tide, which is preventing the great floating engine of the London fire engine establishment from getting upriver. It can't get upriver from Rotherhithe to start fighting the fire from the Thames. And what it does when it finally gets upriver, here you can just about see it there. It's a barge-mounted, huge barge-mounted engine that's able to dip its hose into the Thames and thereby pump the water at the rate of a ton a minute over the buildings. And it's only when that arrives and is in place by about 2 o'clock in the morning that the tide, literally and metaphorically, starts to turn, and the fire is slowed. It's not put out, but it doesn't spread any further. Turner captures this. Turner was on the river as well, and he captures this in one of his 2 very famous paintings of the fire. And this shows the floating engine coming up, being pulled up by this barge. The floating engine is here. It's being pulled up by a barge towards Westminster. This must be Waterloo Bridge here. That's Westminster Hall, right in the middle of the conflagration. So the impact of the barge not getting upriver until the early hours is that the records of the House of Commons are destroyed. That's why there is this terrible loss of records by the House of Commons. What you can see here again is St Stephen's. This is the House of Commons, Westminster Hall behind, but this building here, which has collapsed, you can see it was a 3-storey building which originally had a bow frontage overlooking the river, was the Commons Library, and you can see it's been gutted and the entire frontage has fallen in. And I said earlier we don't exactly know where the Commons records were, but I suspect that a large proportion of them had been decanted into this building when it was built in the 1820s, and there was probably still more of them actually still stored within the offices in the core of the palace behind these buildings here, right in the line of the flames. And here is an example of a very rare survival of a Commons record. There are these 231 Commons journals and maybe 2 or 3 other records. And this is in fact a wage book, as you may be able to see. It's a wage book for the Sergeant-at-Arms office, which was clearly grabbed by somebody because it was on a table. And it goes right up to a couple of days before the fire. It may say, I think it says 14th of October up there. And it was obviously just the working account book that was nearest to somebody's desk. They grabbed it to save it, and you can see that it was rather crudely repaired, probably in the 1940s, but very, very badly singed, as you can see. But that really is one of the only handful of surviving Commons documents apart from the journals. The Lords' records, however, fared much better, I'm pleased to say, because they were stored in 2 locations. One in the Jewel Tower, which was originally part of the medieval palace precincts. It was right on the edge of the outer wall of the palace, as it would have been. At the time of the fire, that was across the road next to the abbey, detached from the Georgian palace as it was then. And that had been the place where all the Acts of Parliament had been stored since the 15th century, and they continued to be stored there at the time of the fire. And so they survived, I'm pleased to say, along with all the other Lord's records, some of which, the more recent ones, were actually stored inside the palace. So on the right-hand side there, you can see the damage done to the palace, the grey bit here, the core of the palace, the medieval core, with record storage occurring in offices inside, and the Commons Library here on the river frontage. But this block here, undamaged, built by John Soane as an extension to the House of Lords offices, again in the 1820s, and protected by the very thick stone walls of the medieval palace. This was undamaged, and it was just, sorry, I'm going to have to get closer, it's just, I think it's this apartment here, under this apartment here, is where the Lord's records, the overflow from the Jewel Tower, was stored. So they had a very lucky escape. But among the records that were saved, not only all the Acts of Parliament, but some of the great constitutional records, including the death warrant of Charles I, which is here, which is one of, well, the greatest treasure of the Parliamentary archives now, but also things like the Bill of Rights and the Great Reform Act and the Petition of Right, and debates about slavery and the rise of empire and civil war and so on, all the records of the Lords that provide some of the gap. They fill some of the gap that's left by the losses in the Commons, but by no means all of the gaps, it has to be said. And they were saved in part by this man, Henry Stone-Smith, a man who deserves to be remembered as an archival hero. I have a campaign to get him into the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Stone-Smith was a clerk in the House of Lords, so a legal administrator. He was a clerk of committees, and he lived nearby, as many clerks did, and he rushed to the scene of the fire. And he organised a human chain to evacuate those records that were in the palace, in the unburnt of the palace. He organised a chain of palace servants and other clerks to get the records out. And that is why some of those Lords' records survived. Here is a copy of an account notebook from the House of Lords, which shows the payments made to all the people in the chain on subsequent days. In fact, first of all, evacuating the records on the night of the fire, the first column, and then subsequently, once the fire has died down, putting it all back again. So payments there for many people sort of shifting the records out and then restoring them again into the palace, and also for the evacuation of books from the Lord's Library. So a few pictures now, a few before and after pictures. This is the Commons before, the Commons chamber before. Just keep your eyes on the three windows at the far end there. You will see what happens afterwards. So what's happened, as you can probably work out, is that the ceiling put in and the floor put in by Christopher Wren to create that little wooden chamber for the Commons to debate in has burnt away, the roof's collapsed and taken with it any wonderful wall paintings that were there from the Middle Ages, any of the stained glass that had survived behind the panelling, and the building is revealed again as the medieval chapel it once was. And antiquaries raved about this view. They felt this was the true palace coming back to life, shed of all the filth and later accretions of politics and so on. The painted chamber was a court, a civil claims court called the Court of Requests at the time of the fire. This is it just before the fire. It was called the Painted Chamber because in the middle of the 13th century it had been built for Henry III as his bedroom, part of a great complex of buildings in the palace. And it had wonderful wall paintings on the walls, some of which were known about at the time of the fire. They'd been surveyed and then re-whitewashed, but you can see a few of them still on these window displays, great gigantic sort of figures of the virtues and vices and allegories about kingship from the Bible and so on. If you just keep your eyes on the three windows again, you can see what it looks like afterwards. So again, the building has collapsed in on itself, and it's just a shell, and any fantastic paintings that were there before have disappeared. But this space, re-roofed and patched up, became the temporary House of the temporary House of Lords, up until 1847 when they moved into their new home. View across the rooftops following the fire, you can just see perhaps a little fire brigade there with their engine damping down the embers. The fire continued for another 5 days or so, but it was finally put out about a week afterwards, and the firemen left. A view across Old Palace Yard again, showing the destruction. It sort of looks partly complete there, but you have to understand that really this is just a shell. This is a shell, there's nothing behind it, it's completely empty. And this stonework is slumping to the ground, endangering passers-by. A close-up on that shows the walls of the Lord's Chamber. Again, this was re-roofed and became the temporary House of Commons up until 1852, when they moved into their new accommodation. The view from the riverside here, the Painted Chamber exterior there, and there's the Commons Library again, completely gutted and collapsed. Nobody dies in the fire as far as we know, which is rather amazing. Plenty of people, however, die during the salvage operations that took place following the fire. Companies came in to salvage the stone and sell it off and other materials from the building. Salvage operatives fell off walls fall on them, they strangle themselves on ropes and so on, fall into holes. So quite a lot of fatalities as a result of that. But here's one guy who hasn't yet managed to kill himself. And then finally, a picture of the old palace, saying farewell to the old palace, just nestled in there. In Old Palace Yard, with the new palace growing up around it, probably sketched from a balloon around 1849, something like that, I think. So out of the fire there were a number of developments. This is a second great Turner picture of the fire, very well known. Both of these paintings are now in America, unfortunately. They left the country in the 19th century, so some of Turner's great masterworks came out of the fire, as well as, obviously, a new Houses of Parliament, that very iconic building. Dickens uses the fire in his work, he was influenced by it. The weights and measures of the kingdom were melted in the fire, and that led to great debates around decimalisation. The first calls for a London fire brigade, a publicly funded London fire brigade, started after this fire because it was thought to be disgraceful that had there been another large fire in London that was insured, the London fire engine establishment would have had to have been called away and Westminster Hall would have been perished. But from our point of view as archivists, the main and most important development, apart from those things, was the creation of the National Archives, the National Record Keeping System. At the time of the fire, the public records were scattered across London. I mentioned that there was some augmentation office records in the palace. The Domesday Book was in the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, just a change of wind direction away from destruction. Many of the augmentation office records were damaged on the night of the fire by being thrown out of the window by Henry Cole, who was a member of the Record Commission, and the Record Commission was the government office in charge of transcribing, storing, overseeing the management of the public records of the kingdom at the time of the fire. And it was today what we would call a failing government department. It wasn't doing its job properly. It had run up massive debts, producing very detailed scholarly transcripts of the records. But the actual management and storage and fire protection of the records was absolutely dire. And in fact, Henry Cole blew the whistle on the Record Commission in the months following the fire. There was a big inquiry that runs to 1,000 pages, if you care to read it, into the Record Commission. It was found to be incompetent in many areas, including in its actions on the night of the fire. As a result, it was closed down. There was a royal commission set up to decide what should replace it. It produced a report in 1836, and the preamble to that report says nobody can now be in any doubt of the danger to our national records from fire. And out of that royal commission came the first piece of legislation governing national record keeping in the UK, the Public Records Office Act of 1838, which ultimately led to the building of this building here in the 1840s, the first wing of the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane, today King's College Library, but I started my career there. Susan will remember it.
Oh, yes.
Yes, it was a groundbreaking building. It was a purpose-built archive for the national records of the kingdom. A huge operation took place to gather all the records from across all those repositories and odd places. They'd ended up in London, from the Chapter House, from the Mews in Charing Cross, from Carlton House Terrace, from the Tower of London where the Chancery records were, from all over the place. They were all gathered finally into Chancery Lane in the 1840s. And James Braidwood, the superintendent of the London Fire Engine Establishment, who'd fought the fire at Westminster with his men, he advised on the fire protection for this new building. And this chap here in the top left here is Francis Palgrave, who was the first keeper of public records at Chancery Lane. He was the first appointed head of the National Archives, if you like. And he had in fact been on the roof of Westminster Abbey, because at the time he was the keeper of the records of the Chapter House, including Domesday Book. He'd been there on the night, desperately praying that the wind didn't change direction and would set the Abbey alight, and with it, not just the Abbey, but all the records in the Chapter House. And he became the first keeper, as I said, of the new Public Record Office. But there was a suggestion when the new Palace of Westminster was built that this building here, the Victoria Tower, the purpose-built building for the Parliamentary records, which weren't part of the Public Record Office system, Parliament being separate from government, the legislature being separate from the executive, there was a suggestion, because this building was planned in 1835, before this one was built, there was a suggestion that could the Victoria Tower be the home of the public records as well as the parliamentary records. And in fact that didn't happen, but at the time there was capacity within the Victoria Tower to store the public records, but events superseded things, and in fact the Public Record Office opened long before the Palace of Westminster was finished. So all of that is why the day of Parliament burned down is worth remembering. So thank you very much.